Right, let's get started. We're taking a deep dive today into, well, the heart of America. We've had a lot of listener questions about what's happening in the Middle Coast.
Oh, yeah.
Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. It seems like more than just, local news.
Right.
And we've got a whole stack of reports and articles and even some, political strategy memos.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah. It really is, when you look at those specific states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, it's like a microcosm of these bigger trends
Right.
that are hitting the entire industrial heartland, Yeah. They're all dealing with those economic changes, the rise of populism, and even anxieties about what the future holds for democracy.
Right. So we're not just talking cheese and cars here.
Yeah.
This is
No.
this is impacting the whole country,
Absolutely.
maybe even the world.
Yeah.
But I got to admit, when I first saw this term, the Middle Coast, I kind of chuckled. Sounds a little
Yeah.
made up, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, the term itself might be relatively new, but the anxieties that it's representing, those are deeply rooted. If you think back to the term Rust Belt,
Right.
turns out that kind of labeling, that can actually do harm to these regions.
Oh, really?
Because it just focuses on the decline.
Oh, okay.
And it misses out on the resilience and the potential that's actually there.
So words matter. That's fascinating.
They do.
So let's ditch the rusty labels and get into the good stuff.
Yeah.
You've been digging into all these sources. What's the big picture?
Yeah.
What's the link between the economics, populism, and democracy in the Middle Coast?
Well, one phrase that kept popping up over and over again was geography of discontent. And it basically means that, places that have been hit hardest by these economic shifts, like the losses in manufacturing,
Right.
they become fertile ground for these populist movements.
Okay.
And it's not just the Middle Coast. We see it in the Brexit voters in the UK, the rise of the AFD in Germany, even the, trucker strike in Canada last year.
Whoa, Canada too. I remember that. So this is like global anxieties, but playing out in little
Yes.
communities.
It is.
But bring it back to the Middle Coast for me. How does this geography of discontent, how does it actually show up in those states?
Well, take Wisconsin, for example. They've seen some really major manufacturing job losses, and you can see the impact of that in the voting patterns, especially if you think back to the 2016 and 2020 elections.
Yeah.
There's a clear correlation between that economic anxiety and the support for candidates who were promising to shake things up.
Right. But we're talking about more than just Wisconsin here, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We've also got Minnesota and Michigan.
Yeah.
And they all have their own,
Yeah.
histories and economies. What are we seeing in those two states?
Yeah, for sure. They definitely share some common ground, but each state kind of has its own flavor, So Michigan, for instance, they were hit really hard by the decline of the auto industry. While Minnesota, they have, a more diverse economy, but they still face a lot of challenges, especially in those rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that even within those states, you see this divide between the urban centers that are doing relatively well and the rural areas that are struggling.
So it's like within the states too.
Yeah.
And you mentioned elections, and 2024 is right around the corner, and this whole thing feels kind of urgent, to be honest.
It is urgent. One of the reports even went so far as to say that political contests cannot be won without the support of residents of rural and deindustrialized regions.
Wow.
And that's a pretty stark statement.
So ignoring the Middle Coast
Yeah.
or any part of the heartland, it's not just politically risky. It sounds like it's
Right.
almost dangerous to the system itself. We're talking about the foundation of democracy here.
Yeah, exactly. When people feel like the system isn't working for them, they're more likely to support, more radical solutions, even ones that might undermine those democratic norms.
Right.
And this isn't just theoretical. We're seeing it play out in real time, not just in the U.S., but around the world.
Okay, so this is getting a little heavy, huh? Global trends, economic anxieties, potential threat to democracy, all wrapped up in this story of the Middle Coast. But before we get to solutions, I think we need to kind of understand the root causes a little bit better.
Yeah.
It can't just be about lost jobs,
Right.
right? What else is feeding this discontent?
Well, you're right. It's much more complex than just jobs. You have to imagine living in a town that was once booming.
Right.
It was like the heart of American industry, and now the factories are silent, the main streets boarded up.
Yeah.
It's a loss of identity. you know, a sense of being left behind, even betrayed by these forces of globalization and technology.
That feeling of being left behind, it's almost like being forgotten, invisible. I bet a lot of people, even outside the Middle Coast, can relate to that feeling.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so crucial to address, because these anxieties, this discontent, it doesn't stay neatly contained in those geographic borders.
Yeah.
It spills over. It influences national politics,
right?
Global trends.
Okay, I'm starting to get a clearer picture of the problem. But what I'm really curious about is what can be done. Is there any hope for these communities, for the Middle Coast, to actually turn things around?
Oh, there's definitely hope. In fact, a lot of these sources lay out some pretty compelling solutions, and what's really exciting is that some of them are already being put into action.
Okay.
Especially in the Middle Coast.
Give me some specifics. What kind of solutions are we talking about here? I'm ready for some good news.
Well, one major theme that came up over and over again was investing in emerging sectors. So think green technologies, advanced manufacturing, things that really play to the strengths of these regions, but also, help them build towards the future.
Right. We can't just recreate the past. Got to look ahead. But are there actually real examples of this happening in the Middle Coast? Otherwise, it's just, wishful thinking.
Oh, absolutely. There are real world examples. So for instance, Grand Rapids, remember we talked about them earlier?
Yeah.
They've gone all in on sustainability. They've set these really ambitious goals for carbon reduction and energy efficiency and even solar energy development.
Yeah, Grand Rapids popped up a few times in these reports. It sounds like they're not waiting around for someone else to fix things for them.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway here. That local leadership, it really matters. They're not just talking about it, they're actually doing it.
Right.
Another example is, all that investment that's going into new semiconductor facilities, especially in Ohio and Michigan.
Right.
And these are, those high-tech, high-paying jobs, the kinds that can really revitalize communities that have been hit hard by those manufacturing losses we talked about earlier.
So some concrete wins are already happening. That's good to hear. Yeah. But, what about those folks who lost jobs in, say, the auto industry?
Yeah.
How do they make that leap to these new sectors?
Well, that's where retraining and reskilling come in. A lot of the sources emphasize the need for these programs to be accessible and affordable.
Right.
So, things like coding boot camps, vocational training specifically in green technologies, even, apprenticeships in advanced manufacturing.
Okay, so it makes sense. But training alone isn't really enough, right?
Yeah.
People need the jobs to actually go to after they get trained.
Right.
So how do we ensure that these new industries are actually creating opportunities in the Middle Coast?
Well, it's kind of a combination of factors. You need to attract new businesses, you got to support the ones that are already there, and then foster this culture of entrepreneurship. Some of the sources talked about things like tax incentives, streamlining regulations, and even creating these innovation hubs where businesses can kind of collaborate and thrive.
Okay, so you're talking about creating an environment where businesses actually want to be, which then leads to those jobs. Yeah. But, sometimes it feels like all the focus is on attracting those big companies, the ones that get those big headlines, those big investments.
Yeah.
What about the smaller businesses, the local shops and restaurants, the places that give a community its actual character?
Oh, that's a really important point. And, the sources really did emphasize that, those small businesses, they're the backbone of any economy, and they need support too. They mention things like access to capital, mentorship programs, and even just creating that sense of community where people, they want to shop local. Okay. They want to support their neighbors.
So it's about creating an ecosystem, I guess, where businesses of all sizes can thrive. But let's be honest, just because an economy is thriving doesn't automatically mean that everyone benefits equally.
Right.
So how do we make sure that this revitalization that actually reaches everyone in the Middle Coast, not just, a select few at the top?
Right. That's where the idea of inclusive growth comes in. It's really about making sure that the benefits of economic growth are shared broadly.
Okay.
Not just concentrated among the wealthy or the already privileged.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, but how does it actually work? What does inclusive growth actually look like in practice?
Well, one interesting example is something called the Preston model, which has been gaining a lot of traction over in the UK. And it's really about democratizing public institutions and encouraging them to reinvest in locally sourced products and services.
So instead of like relying on outside investment, they're keeping the money within their own communities. That's pretty cool. But does that model like actually translate to the US?
Yeah.
Specifically to the Middle Coast?
Well, there are definitely challenges, but there are also some real opportunities. A lot of the sources pointed to things like community-owned banks, worker-owned cooperatives, and even just encouraging local governments to to prioritize buying from local businesses.
So it's almost like a shift in mindset, right? Instead of always looking, outward for solutions, we need to look inward and invest in the assets we already have.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to another crucial aspect of this whole revitalization effort, which is attracting and retaining talent. Young people, they're often drawn to big cities.
Right.
With those vibrant cultures and all those job opportunities.
Right. All the excitement, all the buzz.
Right, exactly. So how do we make the Middle Coast more appealing to the next generation?
That's a tough one. It's hard to compete with the bright lights and the big city buzz. What do these reports suggest?
Well, it's not about trying to be something that they're not, right?
Right.
The Middle Coast, it has its own unique charm, a strong sense of community, affordable living, access to nature. The key is to really leverage those strengths.
Okay.
To create communities where people, they actually want to live, work, and raise families.
Okay, so highlight the quality of life, but that's kind of broad. What are some specific things communities can do? I'm thinking, parks and bike trails.
Yeah.
Maybe some, cool art installations, stuff like that.
You're on the right track. The sources talk about, investing in things like parks and trails, revitalizing downtowns with art and culture.
Right.
And even just fostering that welcoming and inclusive atmosphere where everyone feels like they belong.
So it's about creating a vibe, I guess, an energy that makes people actually want to be there.
Yeah.
But let's be real, a lot of young people today, they're also looking for, good job opportunities.
Right.
How do we make sure that those actually exist in the Middle Coast?
Well, it ties back to those investments we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
Those emerging sectors that focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. But it's also about making sure young people have the skills they need to succeed in those jobs.
Okay.
And that means investing in education from early childhood all the way through college and beyond.
Right. So it's not just about attracting talent. It's about developing the talent that's already there.
Right.
But there's one thing that keeps kind of nagging at me. We've talked about all these solutions. Investing in new industries, retraining workers, fostering entrepreneurship, even creating those vibrant communities. But it all just seems to require a lot of, money.
Right.
Where's all this funding going to come from?
That's a valid question. And the sources acknowledge that, revitalizing the Middle Coast, or any region for that matter, it does require significant investment. They've talked about a combination of public and private funding.
Okay.
From federal grants to venture capital to even philanthropic contributions.
So it's not just about like government handouts. It's about a shared responsibility.
It is.
Everyone's got to chip in to make this happen.
Exactly. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about investing it strategically,
right?
Making sure that those dollars are used effectively to create lasting change.
So it's about being smart with the resources, making sure every investment really counts. But, as we're talking about all of this, I keep thinking about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
We started this whole deep dive talking about global trends, economic anxieties, even like threats to democracy. So how does revitalizing the Middle Coast actually fit into that larger context?
Yeah.
What's the ultimate goal here? As we've been going through all these sources, I've noticed this theme that keeps popping up. And it's not really about specific policies or economic indicators. It's more about the narrative, the story that we tell ourselves about the Middle Coast.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The power of language, of how we frame these issues, is crucial. Remember we were talking earlier about the term Rust Belt.
Right.
That kind of labeling, it can actually be harmful.
Okay.
Because it reinforces this sense of decline and hopelessness.
Right, like all those images we see in the news of abandoned factories and stuff. It's powerful imagery.
Yeah.
But it's only telling one side of the story.
Exactly. It ignores the resilience, the innovation, the potential that actually exists in these communities. And some of the sources, they even suggest, using alternative terms.
Okay.
Like regions of resilience, or even the trust belt, to really highlight the strengths and values of these areas.
A trust belt. I like that. It implies, reliability, a sense of community,
right.
Something solid to build on.
It's about shifting the focus from what's been lost to what's possible. And it's not just about the words themselves. It's about changing the way we think about these regions, both individually and as a society.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? It feels like this deeply ingrained narrative, this idea of the Rust Belt as a place of, decline and despair.
It takes a conscious effort. You have to really commit to highlighting those positive stories, the successes, the examples of communities that are turning things around.
Like those examples we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Grand Rapids going all in on sustainability.
Right.
Those new semiconductor facilities, creating those high-tech jobs.
Those are the stories we need to be telling and retelling.
Right. Right. And it's not just about those big wins.
No.
It's about celebrating like the smaller victories too, right?
Yeah.
Those local businesses that are thriving.
Absolutely.
Those community initiatives that are making a real difference. It's about creating this new narrative, one that's grounded in hope and possibility.
Exactly. It's about changing the story.
Yeah.
But it's also about changing the way we act,
Right. So what can we as individuals actually do to support this revitalization?
Well, first and foremost, be aware of the narrative that you're consuming and the narrative that you're perpetuating. Are you buying into that doom and gloom?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you actively seeking out and sharing those stories of resilience and innovation?
That's a good point. It's so easy to get caught up in all that negativity, especially with what we're constantly being bombarded with in the news.
It is, but you have a choice. You can choose to consume and share content that reinforces a positive vision for the Middle Coast. You can support businesses that are investing in those regions. You can even get involved in those local initiatives that are working to make a difference.
So use our voices, our wallets, our actions to really support the change we want to see. Yeah. But let's step back for a second. Think about the bigger picture.
Okay.
We started this whole deep dive talking about that link between economic anxieties and populism and the future of democracy.
Right.
So how does revitalizing the Middle Coast actually address those larger challenges?
Well, it's all connected. When people feel like the system is working for them, when they have economic opportunity, when they feel a sense of hope and belonging, they're much less likely to be drawn to these extreme ideologies or to support leaders who are just trying to exploit their anxieties.
So revitalizing these communities, it's not just about economics or jobs. It's about strengthening the very fabric of our democracy.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where everyone feels like they have a stake, they have a voice, and they have a future. And the Middle Coast, with its unique challenges and opportunities, it can actually be a model for how to do that.
Yeah. That's a powerful idea. So it's not just about fixing a problem. It's about building something new, something better.
And it's not just about the Middle Coast. The lessons we learn here, the solutions we develop, they can be applied to other regions, both in the U.S. and around the world, that are dealing with these same kinds of challenges.
So it's about sharing knowledge, best practices, even just that sense of hope.
Exactly. Because ultimately, this isn't just about revitalizing specific regions. It's about creating a more just, equitable, and resilient world for everyone.
Wow. That's quite a journey we've been on. We started with this seemingly simple question about the Middle Coast.
Right.
And we've ended up talking about the future of democracy and the fate of the world.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process, but I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the issues at stake.
Yeah.
And the possibilities for real change.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Taking these complex, seemingly overwhelming issues and breaking them down into digestible, actionable insights. But it's important to remember this is just the beginning.
Right. It's up to each of us to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working towards that brighter future that we all envision.
So to all of you listening out there, I leave you with this. What are you going to do with the knowledge you've gained today? How will you contribute to creating that more just, equitable, and resilient world? It's a question worth thinking about.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Middle Coast. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.